by the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda about the contribution that the big countries should make to support the small countries on the subject of net zero and reducing greenhouse gases and emissions. And in fact, Prime Minister, I'm not going to steal your fox. You might just tell us two things. Firstly, what the announcement is, and then perhaps you just, for those that have never been to the sun-kissed beaches of Antigua and Barbuda, a little bit about your country.
Thank you very much, Excellency, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I do not necessarily know that I'll be making any announcement. Perhaps it's just to have a general discussion about the importance of decarbonization for us to move towards net zero in order to protect the planet and to protect human civilization. As our host would have indicated, Antigua and Barbuda has been at the forefront of fighting this climate issue, calling upon large polluters to reduce emissions so that we do not have an overshoot of the 1.5 degrees, failing which we all will suffer the catastrophic consequences of climate change. Antigua and Barbuda has gone as far as seeking an advisory opinion from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea to determine the obligations of states under the UNCLOS Treaty, that is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And what we're seeking to do is to go beyond the voluntary acts of these large polluters and to hold them legally responsible. We all know that with each succeeding COP, that these large polluters, they continue to make many pledges. Most of these pledges have not materialized. In fact, they are literally gaming the system, and they are putting the civilization of many small island states, including Antigua and Barbuda, and some more, at risk. We are literally on the front lines of climate change, suffering the devastating consequences of climate change. And practically all of the effects of climate change are present in our respective countries, from rising sea levels to very ferocious and frequent hurricanes, literally decimating our economies and destroying lives and livelihoods on an annual basis. But we observe that despite all of the pledges that have been made and despite the requirements of the Paris Agreement, that many global leaders continue to see these COPs, these conferences of the parties, as opportunities to make grand statements, but they are not necessarily committed to meeting the ambitions as indicated in their respective national determined contributions. So we felt that there ought to be a complementary legal pathway to hold these countries responsible. And that is why we sought this advisory opinion from ITLAS. And you'll be aware that last May, we got a favorable decision that confirmed that these countries, they have an obligation to protect the marine environment. In as much as ITLAS does not preside over the terrestrial environment, they also have an obligation to protect the terrestrial environment. And I'm pretty sure that the other advisory opinions that will be sought, including the one that is sponsored by Vanuatu, in which they are seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, that a similar decision will be taken in that all countries, all of humanity for that matter, we all have an obligation to protect the planet and to ensure that we bequeath a planet to future generations, one that is healthy and one that is sustainable. So I believe that these opinions are important from the standpoint of seeking to hold these large polluters accountable and at the same time to help them to increase their ambitions and to deliver on their commitments. So from that standpoint, we believe that Antigua and Barbuda and other countries are literally playing their part in terms of ensuring that we reduce emissions, that we achieve net carbon or carbon zero, perhaps by about 2050 by the latest, failing which we may not have a planet on which to live. And we only have one planet. There's no planet B. which means that all of us have to become advocates for the reduction of emissions and for the decarbonization of the planet in order to ensure its long-term sustainability. I don't want to go on and on.
No, I think that...
But just to state...
We'll come back to this in a minute,
sure. Okay.
Prime Minister.
Fine.
Just give us a little bit of a flavour, because most people in this room haven't been to Antigua, about the other economic issues that surround Antigua and Barbuda, and give us a flavour of the country as a whole.
Yeah, well, Antigua and Barbuda is literally in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, in the middle of Caribbean countries between Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. And I'll add here one of the most advanced economies within the Caribbean region. Certainly an open economy, one that is open to investment, open to tourists. And we continue to advance the living standards of the people of Antigua and Barbuda, notwithstanding the myriad challenges that we face with, including the issue of climate, to the extent that Antigua and Barbuda is considered to be a high-income country based on the relatively high per capita income of its citizens. But notwithstanding that, I will say that Antigua and Barbuda is easily one of the best places to vacation, one of the best places to have a second home. So if you're thinking about a second home in the Caribbean, evidently Antigua and Barbuda is a place to be.
I'm thinking of a first home in the Caribbean.
Well, I recommend that. And certainly in terms of our tax regime, in fact, we have no personal income tax, and it's a low tax, high investment jurisdiction that continues to attract a significant amount of foreign direct investments, to the extent I believe that currently we have enjoyed perhaps the largest amount of investments per capita of any country within the Caribbean region. So just a great place to live. It's a melting pot. We have individuals from all nationalities living in Antigua and Barbuda. People are very hospitable, and certainly one of the best climates, similar to Samoa. The most exciting beaches in the world. In fact, Antigua alone, to exclude our sister island Barbuda, has 365 beaches, one for every day of the year. And if you include Barbuda, I guarantee you that it's probably about 400 or 500 beaches. So again, a great place to live, and we certainly would invite you to visit. Thank you.
Well, I can attest to that. And there's almost a stampede of people. They're all gone on their phones booking flights. Dino, your business, of course, was heavy metals, not the rock band, but the rocks, heavy metals, and of course shipping, which are two very carbon-heavy industries. That is how the business founded. You and your chairman, Andrew Forrest, have set upon a very rigorous program of reducing carbon. Do you want to just talk us through the background to, and what Fortescue is on the first question? And the second question is, what are these rigorous steps that you've taken?
Sure, thank you, and good morning, everybody, distinguished guests. Also, your comments, Prime Minister. I think at this period on our planet, we need real leadership. And it's great to hear stories like yourselves and Hank, and also now to meet the founder of all of my hours of misspent youth on Tetris. I thought, I do believe in fate, and I think it's right here that we're meeting to hear such a great story. In fact, the story of Fortescue is not too dissimilar to that of Hawaii. So our founder, Dr. Andrew Forrest, who sent his apologies today, that's why I'm here telling the story today. He started this company 20 years ago. We've grown it to be one of the biggest mining companies in the world. At the same time, we're also one of the planet's largest emitters of CO2. The products that we make contribute to nearly 12% of the total emissions on the planet in the manufacture of steel. So we have an obligation to do something about that. So our chairman put forward a very rigorous target, as you say, Lord Harland, of real zero by 2030. I just want to explain what that actually looks like, because I think the reason why there are so few leaders standing up but I wrote down your message, Hank. You need to have a target and a real plan. And although how ambitious that target was, and for somebody like me who's grown up in an industrial environment where emissions was just part of the business, it changes your thinking dramatically. From one of excitement, anger, apprehension, but then as time settles in, the solutions to those problems become quite apparent. And you don't look to where you were before to solve some of those problems in the future. So for us as an organisation, the last 3 years, since we've announced that target, has been a complete change in ideology. We've had to reconfigure the entire way you run an organisation. And a little bit of what we do. We span over 1,000 kilometres in the northwest of Australia. We're isolated, we're remote, we import all of our hydrocarbon to give us the energy to run a fleet of large mining equipment, 700 of them. We have trains, we have a fleet of ships to export our product into Asia and the rest of the world, all of which was on its IV line of hydrocarbons. 1 billion litres of diesel a year we burn. So to rid ourselves in a few short years of that entire consumption of hydrocarbons is an enormous challenge. To do that, we've had to partner with organisations we would never have dreamed of partnering with. From small mum and dad shops to large multinationals. But what we seek out is the thought leadership that the Prime Minister, Hank, many of you in the room actually give. That's where it starts. You need to work on this journey together. Because hand in hand, you solve some of the problems which makes this challenge so huge. And our experience is some of those problems, financing, approvals, to technology. Once you have that belief and that partnership, having worked all over the world in some of the most developing countries in the world, human creativity can solve them. But there has to be a will, there has to be a deadline, there has to be a drive. So for us, we've invented technology to decarbonise shipping. Who would have thought a little old mining company in Australia sailed into COP with a ship running on green ammonia? Where others were talking about it, our chairman physically drove the ship into the port in Dubai. Thank you. Because my experience is when people can see and touch and feel change, adoption happens remarkably quick. 2 weeks ago, I was in Las Vegas at the world's biggest mining show, and we unveiled a green mining truck. This thing is 250 tons in size. It's completely electrified, running off a solar grid. We will have 500 of them driving around in the next 2 years. At the same time, we're offsetting 1 billion litres of diesel. For us, it's an economic decision to go green, not just a philanthropic one. Lord.
Well, that's an amazing story. And what do you say it's an economic one? How do you measure that?
Well, as Hank said, we're mostly business people here in the room, and it's actually quite simple. We paid X for a litre of diesel. You don't have to buy that anymore, and it comes off our bottom line. That money then needs to be reinvested in the capital that goes into electrifying your fleet. But it's very similar to EV penetration you're seeing globally. Once people get their head across the upfront capital cost, but then factor in the long-term ownership and cost model of running this equipment, that was our first surprise. Is wow, the total cost of owning this fleet is actually already in its first generation of technology cheaper than its hydrocarbon equivalent. And then the conversation with finances is, as Hank said, is completely different. You must change the business model. And once that happens, the penny drops for many people. And then there's just an influx. You just have to create it once, and then the entire world pivots. Because my fundamental belief is I think people do want to create a better future for their children. My 3 boys, I want to leave this planet the same way I enjoyed it. And you give people an option that's economic, and there will be a flock of investment and a flock going this way.
Absolutely. So, Prime Minister, how do you drive the EV revolution into Antigua and Barbuda?
Well, let me react to the work that Fortescue is doing. I think it is remarkable, and it shows very clearly that we can transition into renewables, and that the future is certainly in renewables, that it can be done in a more sustainable way, that companies can achieve sustainable profits by transitioning into renewables. We all know that renewables are an equalizer, and that there are some fossil fuel companies that believe that this transition could place them at a competitive disadvantage. So they continue to game the system. They capture policymakers, including politicians, with their lobbyists, and they have deliberately slowed down the transition. I think that Fortescue would have shown us that with commitment and determination that we can transition into a greener and certainly a more profitable enterprise by transitioning into renewables. And certainly in the case of Antigua and Barbuda, as one of the global advocates for a just transition and for a quick transition into renewables to avert the catastrophic consequences of climate change, we continue to lead by example. So we are literally decarbonizing our own country, even though, as far as we're concerned, we are probably carbon negative. And I say this in the context that as a very small country with very negligible emissions, and the fact that we're a large ocean state with seagrass, seascape, mangroves that are sequestering a significant amount of carbon on an annual basis, more than what we emit. I'm pretty sure that we are carbon negative, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we have the moral authority to call out those who continue to violate, those who continue to increase the emissions and thereby imperiling the planet. So for us, we have been literally decarbonizing our ports, both our airport and seaport. By 2027, both our cargo and airports will be net zero by transitioning into renewables. They'll be powered exclusively by renewables. In fact, our sister island, Barbuda, is currently powered about 70% of the day by renewables, and within the next 24 months, that island will be completely powered by renewables. So we believe that that type of example is important so that others can understand that the transition into renewables is for the benefit of all, not only the present, but for future generations. And that this notion that transferring into renewables will not be, or will be cost prohibitive and cost ineffective. It is the ultimate sustainable position to take to provide energy security, to avoid the vagaries in the movement of fossil fuel prices, which is a major issue for most small islands. Have clean, green energy. In fact, our electric vehicle fleet, for example, has been increased on an annual basis. And we're hoping by about, I'd say, 2035 that we will be net zero in terms of the emissions from fossil fuel vehicles. So we're not only speaking, we are literally implementing that program of getting to net zero by about 2040. In fact, what we've done within the last couple of years was to transition into cleaner form, and I say clean in inverted commas, of fossil fuel energy by transitioning into LNG. And by about 2030, no later than 2033, we will totally phase out the LNG plant as well and to ensure that Antigua and Barbuda is powered almost exclusively by renewables and thereby becoming net zero and to be an example for other countries. But again, I have to commend Fortescue because at the end of the day, it is at the micro-organizational level in which you'll be able to achieve this decarbonization, because the carbonization has taken place at that micro-organizational level. And to have a firm like Fortescue leading and to showing how they can develop a sustainable carbon-free model, I think it's remarkable and should be replicated by others. Thank you.
Can I just sort of have a follow-on question? So, as a citizen of Antigua and Barbuda, I have a car. It's cost me a lot of money. I'm not a very well-off person. We have this situation now in the UK where people are seeing that there isn't the successful grid to charge up cars, that they're more expensive. The charging is more expensive because electricity is more than fuel at the moment. How do you persuade those people to move to a EV from a aspirated vehicle?
First of all, let me state that in Antigua and Barbuda, we subsidize the electric vehicles. Duties are waived so that there are no duties on imported electric vehicles. But again, it comes back to the policymakers. We all know that the fossil fuel industry is heavily subsidized. And until such time as we reduce those subsidies and to make the funding available to accelerate the transition to renewables and to reduce the price of these renewable energy applications, include EVs, then we'll have a problem. So the fact that currently, petroleum products or fossil fuel products may be cheaper than electricity, it is because of the current subsidies that the fossil fuel companies are literally enjoying. And what is required here is greater commitment for policymakers now to provide more funding to transition to renewables, to drive down the cost of renewables. And if we observe the price of renewables includes solar, wind, and the price would have reduced significantly during the last decade. And as you have more people utilizing these renewable energy applications, then clearly the price will go down. So the issue is about reducing demand for fossil fuel products, increasing the demand for renewables, and ultimately you will have a price correcting mechanism in which renewables ultimately will become cheaper and certainly more sustainable.
Thank you.
Dino,
sorry.
If I add a point to that,
Yep.
I think education is really key, because I think there's a myth that exists that fossil fuels are actually cheaper. But when you build up the theory on the structural cost of fossil fuels to the mum and dad out there, and you then demonstrate how much of their taxpayer dollar goes into making their own cost cheaper, once that is understood by people, you get this momentum, particularly the youth. Then they will demand, I do not want that to happen anymore. And then policymakers and politicians start taking note. That's the voter base. I think once you get that shift, all of a sudden change happens. Because structurally, the cost, as you say, of renewables and wind now and solar is structurally on parity, if not cheaper already. That's why all we call for is a level playing field, not more incentive, just a level playing field. And you'd be surprised how quickly this change happens.
And if I may add here too, if you also adjust for the fact that, let's say with electric vehicles, that you no longer have to purchase gas, diesel over a period of time, and you amortize the cost of the vehicle over a 10-year period, then clearly it'll be far cheaper. The electric option is far cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that Antigua, the distance travelled, because it's a small island, means that it's it's much more suitable to have an electric vehicle because you don't have to do the distance that you do have to in other countries, which is one of the drawbacks to electric vehicles. Dino, just carrying on with your business, I mean, you had to presumably get buy-in from shareholders for this transition. You have to get buy-in from your customers. Talk to us a little bit about that, how you went about it, but also then talk to us a little bit about what industry colleagues or competitors are following your example?
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe start with
Good. I've gone to the top of the class.
yeah. I laugh because the latter has been quite a journey for me. I remember my first request to our suppliers on providing green equipment, and they literally looked at me, thought I was crazy. And their answer was, sure, you can have it by 2050. And I said, no, we need it by 2030. And they'd just look at you with this complete disbelief. And these are major manufacturers from the US, Japan, China. There's some pretty heavy hitters. And I was worried about that reaction because I knew what was coming. Our chairman said, well, if they can't do it, you build it. And we looked at him and said, no.
You must love your chairman.
It's you are crazy now. And sure enough, in less than 100 days, we built a mining truck. And last week we released a train that was fully green. Sure, it did not last long. The range was only 8 minutes. It was a pretty ugly looking thing, to be completely frank. But what it did show, it showed the traditional supplier base that disruption could happen from the remote part of the thinking possible. And that got them scared. And the very next day, the phone rang by the 5th largest OEM, a German company. And they suggested, well, how about we work together on this? And we thought, oh no, it's happening. We felt like the dog that caught the bus, and we're on the bus and we didn't really know what to do. And we thought, well, we need to actually find some people who are really good at this. So we went to Oxford, actually. And the story has its roots with Sir Frank Williams and his racing company. About 10 years ago, he started an all-electric power system business. And we went there, and it was owned by some PE guys from the States, and it really wasn't a partnership in heaven. So we made a bid for this company. And about 4 days later, we owned Williams Advanced Engineering, the preeminent electronic power system company in the world. They supply all the Formula E racing cars with their power system. So all of a sudden, we had the truck manufacturer, we had the demand, and we had this group of 500 engineers in Oxford. And 2 years later, we've launched a commercial product that we can now sell. And that's fascinating in itself, but what I found most enlightening was those hardcore dinosaurs of the supply world have bought their 2050 plans into 2030. So all of a sudden, they are spruiking the same narrative we were. And that was probably our proudest moment, is that you don't have to go and buy our truck. You can buy a truck or a train from anyone else, but it's green. And that is our mission.
So you built a new business. Very good. So coming back to the beginning, Prime Minister, you've made a comment about the legal requirement of the major countries to honour their commitments. I mean, you're slightly taking on the Goliath, aren't you?
Not necessarily. Again, if we all committed to saving the planet and to ensure the sustainability of human civilization, then there's a need for all of us to work together. So we believe that the large polluters should see this as a complementary pathway to drive action to accelerate the transition into renewables. And I'm very pleased that at the micro-organization level that Fortescue is driving the type of creative and, let's say, creative destruction in the energy sector that they are now helping to ensure that this transition happens at a faster rate. Now, let us not forget that the most significant existential threat facing all of humanity is the issue of climate, not even nuclear warfare, because at the end of the day, there's this concept of mutually assured destruction that helps to keep these nuclear powers in check. But insofar as climate is concerned, there's no control over climate impact, and the consequences are becoming more devastating. And we know that they'll be catastrophic if we do not come together as a human civilization to collectively address this issue. So again, there should not be a David or Goliath or David and Goliath issue. This ought to be seen as a complementary pathway to support the voluntary actions of the large polluters, and for them to understand, or to remind them at least, of their obligation to protect the marine and terrestrial spaces, and for us to work together, recognizing our common humanity in saving the planet and to ensure the sustainability of human civilization.
But how do you start that conversation with India, China, Nigeria, which is going to have a bigger population than America, obviously places like Indonesia, which are almost full carbon?
Well, as far as we're concerned, there's no free passage for any country, for anyone. We recognize that historically, most of the emissions came from the G7 countries, and they too must be held responsible for their historical emissions. And we do accept that we ought to take into consideration the energy security of countries and the time that is required for them to make the transition. But where there is a lack of commitment and they try to stretch the transition into 2060, 2070, 2080, we ought to know that we cannot entertain that lack of commitment, because ultimately they'll be imperiling the planet. Fortescue, as one of the largest emitters, would have demonstrated in tangible ways how quickly that transition could be made. So we all know that those countries that continue to argue that because of their energy security they can only transition until maybe 2050, 2060, we know that the fundamental issue here is a lack of commitment, and we must hold all of them accountable. Now, insofar as compensation where climate damage is concerned, I will accept that these emerging economies, developing countries that are large emitters, clearly they should carry a smaller portion of the burden of compensation compared to the wealthy countries that have been historical emitters and would have done far more damage as a result of their historical emissions. So we do subscribe to the principle of differentiated treatment to some extent, but not to the extent of giving any country a free pass. We are all ultimately responsible for the issue of climate change. We are all responsible to fighting this issue collectively and to ensure the sustainability of our planet. As I said before, there's no planet B, so let us work together, having an all-of-society approach to literally protect our planet in the interest of all, not only this generation, but future generations.
Dino, just finally, you didn't really answer my question about what are your competitors doing and getting to adopting this strategy that you have, or other businesses, not necessarily your competitors.
I wasn't, purposely trying to avoid the question, but I guess I did.
Well, I wasn't going to let you avoid it.
I think when you're within an organisation that has a real zero by 2030, everything else seems slow, right? But sometimes you just need to step up and smell the roses and observe that other organisations are actually moving at pace as well. And I look at the China example because often it's criticised that it's continuously emitting more carbon than it should, but they've actually reached peak carbon. They've installed 350 gigawatts of renewable energy last year. This year they're on track to exceed that. That same plan will be executed for the next 20 years. And I believe that they will come in ahead of their 2050 neutrality targets. It's also an opportunity for us all to continue to drive down price. So what are our competitors doing? They're watching us very closely. They're seeing us adopt the adopt the challenge. And we're putting pressure on shareholders because up until you have a first mover, the shareholder has an excuse that it's too difficult. Now, that same shareholder that holds stock in our competitors will ask the same question, why can't you do it if they can? Which means rather than it being an adversarial conversation, we are actually working together with our competitors in this space, which I think is, again, who would have thought that that would happen? I think it's a great step forward. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've got two incredibly brave people in the room. Obviously, Fortescue being brave and setting out their stall to get to net zero, or real zero, much more to the point, by 2030, which makes them way ahead of any other business in the world. And David here, or should we call it Antigua and Barbuda, through its great Prime Minister, has decided to challenge those countries that do not recognise the importance of saving the planet in the way that he and his country does. And he stuck his neck out to make sure that delivery happens rather than is talked about. And this is to be thoroughly applauded, which I hope you'll do now, in thanking them for sparing the time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Now, next on our program, we have our networking break. Please grab yourself a glass of water, a cup of coffee in the lobby, and also downstairs. Our next session will start at 11:30 a.m. Thank you for your attention.